Our primary objective of this conference was to try and elevate this topic to a wider audience. So thanks all of you who participated, because I think there's just so much going on in New York with Rudy and Commissioner Akiba and Hawaii. Thank you guys so much for coming. I know, long way to go. But I think it's really up to all of us to try and communicate better on all the innovation that's happening and really help develop these markets. So final thing is to say thanks to SMUD for hosting us again, all of our sponsors, and in particular, the Energy Foundation today. So we have really an incredible panel to end up here. Amongst all four of these gentlemen who know each other exceptionally well, I'm the awkward one, as Gavin had mentioned with EDF, of looking down the line of people who have such experience working with every energy agency in and out of government. Truly an incredible spectrum of people that are with us. I don't know if I'm going to make any introductions here. I think everybody's on our agenda. So I'm going to leave it at that. We're going to go informal because this is a great group. I've encouraged them to ask questions amongst themselves, and then we're going to hopefully have a bit of time for question and answers. But I think if talking about, with all of these folks up here, there's obviously 40+ years of experience of working on energy issues in the state of California and across the country. I'm already getting laughs, so it might be tough. But really, as we talked about in this conference, of really how the distribution grid is changing so much with all the new technologies that are upon us and all of the changes that we're looking at across the country of looking at the different utility structures. My first question was really for each of you to talk about how does this compare to some of the other energy issues we've seen in California over the last 40 years? How would you put this in perspective for folks? And then how can that help guide us in the future of looking at the history? So Michael, could you maybe start, and then Bob?
I think that the renewable portfolio standard was very focused. It required us to reach 33% of our electricity from renewable sources. I think that the new era that we're moving into, where we're going to start to define things in terms of greenhouse gas emissions more explicitly, is going to create a different set of challenges. And so it's going to call into question this issue of what's cost effective in a different way. Again, avoided cost of new electricity infrastructure, new generation will be redefined. I think to be able to really look at how we reach these new cost effectiveness tests probably is out there further. I've had this discussion more with the ratepayer advocates and the environmental advocates, however, than I have with most of the other people who have been involved in the grid. So that really needs to be challenged, contested, and discussed as to how we go about that. It's an enormously different approach to things. I think that to really think about the future and the fact that it's changing so quickly, there's so many new technologies, we will not operate off of one scenario probably. We'll operate off of very different scenarios to be able to actually look within the overlaps to figure out what are the least regrets next steps that actually satisfy a variety of future needs in terms of the distribution system. How do we begin to define that? Then within that, I think we start to look at what are the best ways to finance that. Is that tariffs that actually enable a lot of acquisition of these resources by a variety of providers? Is it part of the rate base? We've struggled with that over battery storage. Half of the battery storage requirement can be through utility procurement that goes into their rate base. Half of that's going to be competitive. So I think that we're actually moving tentatively into the future, again, trying a lot of small experiments rather than trying to put too much all in one specific future, simply because we're already down this path. I think that at some point, to figure out how all these fit together, we are just going to have to do that. And it looks to me, in my mind, that we probably ask everybody to pick a specific geographic area and saturate it with all these opportunities, and then begin to explore that. And I think we're already starting to see that come into path. Simply because it fits the needs of the system and it fits the historical and technical situation that we're in. That's really different, I think, than where we've been in the past, where we actually get a very consolidated general rate case with a lot of infrastructure and a lot of procurement, and then we decide it all at once. That's
Yeah, I tend to look back to the whatever glory days when I was a kid.
You press the button.
Okay, and looking back to the 70s, again, I would have to say that was the time of the greatest transitions. And that was a time where, it was vertically integrated utilities. And there was a regulatory compact, and basically that ran into the end of the line at that stage. And the fundamental part where it ran into the end of the line was that, if you look at Alfred Kahn and you ask the basic question of what are the utility functions or services, it's where there are economies of scale. And where there are not, then it should be an unregulated service. So in the 70s, that became obvious for generation. That on the one hand, that was when the utilities were pursuing coal and nuclear, relatively large central stations, and we suddenly discovered that, energy efficiency, renewables, cogeneration was much cheaper. And so that was when the PUC had the first thing of saying, well, wait a minute. We had this nice little picture, utilities would invest in generation, the shareholders would get the earnings from that, and that would lower rates. And suddenly they would invest in generation and rates would go up. And at that point, we started getting into the question of, okay, how to really start changing that? How to change the PUC? The PUC in this, that was a period of time where the PUC was primarily engineers and accountants, and that was when under the Energy Policy Act of '78, people said, well, what about economists? That was when Alfred Kahn back in the New York Commission was really revolutionizing what people thought a utility commission should do. And so, and that was certainly, again, the first Brown administration, and it was an opportunity to rethink things and to really start talking about things like, decoupling, incentives for energy efficiency. So renewable, so I guess what I'm saying, that was huge in terms of what we're looking at. Now, as Michael said, what we're looking at now is on some of these other areas, are they utility functions or not? And again, I come back to saying if there's economies of scale, that's utility function. It's the basic, you're not going to run, a series of competing distribution lines. At least the premise is that it's cheaper just to have a distribution system. And so again, as you look at these various functions, and since that time, we have tried different experiments in California. Things like, should building services be competitive? Should procurement be competitive? A lot of other aspects of that, and certainly we've had real sweeping changes in the gas world. But again, it comes back to, I guess what I'm saying is, it's one thing to think about these various new products and services, and if in fact they can provide value to consumers, then God bless, get the utilities out of the way. And conversely, if they don't, then they're sort of going against the winds, really, on where things are going to end up eventually. And it's also the other thing that really was important at that time is equally important. So again, what's your basic framework for regulation? What's, how do you really use competitive forces to bring those new products and services in, but realizing there is a fundamental role for the utilities. We can certainly get into that much more, but and my classic example we've all talked about is that on the one hand, we have the very smart energy nerds who like to have all kinds of options, and we have a substantial amount of our citizens who are either low income, rent it, and no one's going to be banging on their doors selling them products because they're probably a bad credit risk, or people who just don't want the hassle. And so at the end of the day, the utilities are going to have even with these changes, really a fundamental role going forward. But again, how do we really harness those competitive forces? And I would tend to say one of the things we thought a lot about at that point is pricing signals. And again, one of the most powerful tools the PUC has is rate design. You know, and certainly anything we could ever, if we could ever connect the retail and wholesale markets into coherent pricing signals, I think you know, it's like once we did avoided cost, like bang, you know, it just skyrocketed in terms of the amount, although we kept screwing around before that point. So I guess I'm saying if we can get the right pricing signals, you can really see innovation move through. And certainly the other part, particularly with the renewables qualified facility program, was trying to bring some creativity into the utility sector. It's not a particularly innovative area, and to bring that in and also bring a new source of capital. So I said there's a lot of challenges, but I would tend to, again, pull people back to the 70s and what worked, what didn't work, and some of the ways of thinking about these issues.
Steve, comments on what Bob said, or at least on the historical side? You guys, either one.
Tony, maybe I could take it, add a little color in a little different way. Clearly, the industry is undergoing unprecedented change. We now have about 2,000 megawatts across our system of distributed generation, and it's growing at a phenomenal rate. We're adding across the system about 7,000 rooftops a month, if you can kind of get your arms around that, between the San Diego, Edison, and PG&E system. So moving from 2,000 megawatts to 10,000 megawatts is really not that big of a leap when it's growing at 5% compounded rate per month. So you can see these dynamic changes going on the grid. Now, you get to some questions about, is it cheaper to have central station solar or distributed generation of some type? At some point, it's kind of irrelevant because this trend is going to continue. And then you throw the specter of storage upon that, you'll have substantial change onto the grid. And the thing then you have to think about is the planning for the future. What impact does it have on assets that exist today, whether they be generation or transmission assets, and what role will all that play? It's a lot of unknowns, and I know you want to have a panel that has a bunch of experts, and you have someone who say, well, there's a bunch of unknowns, but there are. And I think we have to be in a position where the following: the utilities at some point are going to have to become agnostic about what customers do, whether they decide to self-provide or buy it from them or whatever. Now, that means they're going to have some sort of billing. Because when I talk to solar providers of systems, they all say, well, we need the grid. And then I talk to others who have put storage in their garage or solar on the roof. They've still have connected to the utility. So in all cases, the wires continue to exist. And then you have to have a mechanism to compensate the utilities for providing those services. And I think that's a conversation that has to occur in the specter of this changing environment. Now, we also have these issues with duct curves and overgen. I know you've talked about that. We'll talk about that if you want to get into it. But those would be my just overall view on how the system is changing.
Excellent. Ron, no pressure. Our only utility person up here from Edison, but
That's
appreciate
okay.
you speaking.
It's all right, I'm among friends. You know, I'm glad you didn't call this last panel the more than old panel. When Bob talks about the 70s, it's not because he read about it in books. Bob and I were both at the Energy Commission when it started, so but we were both really young at the time. At that time, we were both idealistic young men, and now we're just idealistic. But I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind, California has gone through so much, and anybody who's having been a consultant for some 30 years prior to my utility gigs, you've seen a lot around the country and around the world, and everyone still looks to California for its changes, and everything from energy efficiency that talked about to how we implemented PURPA quicker than most people did, and what we did through the formation of the CAISO and the markets, and then how that had a little bit of hiccup in the early part of the last decade, to what we're doing now, actually what we've done with RPS and what we're doing now. I mean, and what we're doing now in terms of dealing with more distributed energy resources and putting that, takes the combinations and the learnings from all of those in something that's way more complex than all of them individually and puts them all together. I think I think we will move there relatively quickly. But I think the key point that I'd like to make is that this isn't just about technology. It's a combination of technology, it's outreach and educating customers, it's contracting with those customers, it's working with those customers and dealing with third parties in a way that meets the CAISO's protocols, which are, going to deal with some uncertainties as we go forward with that. It's the operational side of that to maintain reliability and learning this in a very real-time way. The benefit, one of the things I was saying is Southern California Edison, partially as an outgrowth of the exit from the San Onofre plant, partially from out of concern with respect to what's going to happen in terms of the continuation of once-through cooling gas-fired plants that used to be Edison's before 1998, and whether they're going to be there or not, focuses an even greater interest on how our distributed energy resources is going to work. And the area that's most key for us is the South Orange County area. That it's reliable, it's fine, everything's great. Also happens to be the area where we have some of the most significant growth. Significant growth these days, it's looking at 2.5% per year growth in that area. It's about a 1,200 megawatt base. And it looks like it's been growing about 30 megawatts a year, and we expect it to continue. If we don't interrupt that, it's going to continue. Well, we want to interrupt that. So we have a preferred resources pilot that we worked with the commission on, with the PUC on this, to do something that is exactly about everything we're talking about here today, to try to make and move the needle on getting this implemented, getting more energy efficiency, and not just the energy efficiency that we grew up with, of just how many kilowatt hours per year can you reduce, but how can you predict within a reasonable band when those kilowatt hours are going to come off the system and rely upon that on a time-of-day basis. That's new and it's different. Customers don't do that. We don't have programs that do that. We don't have incentives that do that, but we will. And demand response, which isn't demand response, so we'll pay a commercial customer or industrial customer something and they get terribly upset if they ever get interrupted. We're looking at demand response where we expect that you will get interrupted. And we're going to pay you in a way that does that, and we're going to do that with good notice and smart communications and technology. We've not done that on that. To do more with energy storage on both the customer side of the meter and on our side of the meter, and have that be applied. And then, of course, importantly, distributed generation, which in South Orange County, frankly, that means solar. And in an area where, frankly, it hasn't grown all that much on its own accord. We want to pull all of those together. We want to move that needle. And as we've looked at that, and Eric Takieso here spoke earlier today on that, Eric is leading up a lot of that effort from the distribution side for us on that, how that all works. And one of the first things we came to was like, okay, putting all of these resources in an area that is only 5% of Edison's service territory is too big to test. We actually need to get our hands around a handful of circuits as at least part of that effort to try to concentrate more of all those distributed resources in there to test them more realistically and more robustly to do that. That's something that hasn't been done before other than little tiny microgrid studies that have been there. So my point to all of this is that we're going to do all of this in a real-time basis, learning all of those things, the technologies, the contracting, the customer outreach, the performance here on a way that I think is going to, I know it's going to inform us. I think it's going to inform California, and it may inform hopefully beyond that realm to get that done. When we talked earlier, there was a lot of discussion earlier today about disruptive technologies, and I'm actually offended by that term. Because to me, it comes across as a pejorative term. It's a disruptive. We want to enable those technologies. Edison is now effectively a wires company. We produce less than 20% of our own energy, and we never expect to produce more than that. We've turned into a very different type of entity. So our goal is to understand those technologies. They're disruptive if you don't know they're coming, and they somehow sneak into your system and you don't know about it. Well, neither of those are going to happen. We're all about learning. That's why we're all here today. We're here about learning about these technologies. What are their opportunities? What are their weaknesses? And how can we make them work? And I think California, go back to all the things that that we've talked about here, what we've done, I think we're in a pretty good place. From a regulatory learning perspective, a technology, a customer base that tolerates us learning through the process and to make some of these things happen. But I think of everything that we've done in the last 40 years, this is the toughest. And I'm hopeful that it actually still might happen when our careers are still in full flow here, Laura.
A great perspective. And I think I might open this for anyone to answer. It was interesting for the speakers today, hearing Susan Kennedy, who was great, of talking about the need for not doing another pilot project, to Paul Lau reminding us that we had to stay up till 4 in the morning with stakeholders to defend the projects that they were doing. Ron, you as well as Michael, another topic of conversation today was about the AB 327, and Arthur and Dave talked a little bit about what they're involved with of trying to provide guidance with Commissioner Picker on that. But by July of next year, there needs to be a plan for how you're going to invest in the distribution grid. How do you address the issue of pilots, and how do we test getting distribution resources on the grid and consumer behavior? How do we figure out what really can work in giving you guys and others a latitude to invest in those type of projects? So anyone?
You know, we're sort of in the realm of uncertainty. And so nobody knows all the answers here. And I don't think we have a clear picture of what the future looks like. So that's why I say that we have to model a variety of scenarios and try to pick the least regrets. And then we'll reiterate that probably over time. Because there we are, again, building this car while we drive it. I think that there's pilots and there are pilots. I mean, it is true that frequently when we don't know what to do and we want to put people off, we create a pilot. But here, I think we want to consciously create pilots with very specific outcomes so that we can learn. You know, I learned a lot by jumping off the roof when I was 8 years old to about 15 years old. And one of the things I learned is that my mother was right. She said that sooner or later you're going to regret that. And now my ankles hurt a lot. And so I think we don't want to repeat useless experiments. I think we want to, but we do want to make the right mistakes. And we want to learn from them. I mean, where does good judgment come from? It comes from experience. Where does experience come from? It comes from bad judgment. And I'm a living testimonial to that. I hope that we don't do that in this setting. I think we don't want to be jumping off a roof here, particularly given that we have a lot of things underway. I think that we have to listen to our moms. But again, I think the goal here is to actually have some clear set of expectations, as SMUD did with their time of use critical peak pilot test. They are actually testing not only could customers absorb this, but what helped them to do that the most, and what helped their customers. And so I think that's what I think Ron is talking about. I think that we'll probably see some other pilots in that model.
Ron, is Edison going to jump off a roof?
I'm going to keep it just jumping off curbs, okay? I think, no, we're not going to jump off a roof, but one of the things that I think is also important as we go through this process is getting a good communication between the commission and the utilities on exactly this issue of what are the outcomes that we want to test. And that's going to require probably a more fluid environment than we've had in the past, and probably is going to test a little bit more of the speed at which we as utilities can design pilots to determine what's big enough to test but small enough to fail, right? So that we learn from that. And be able to take those learnings from that, things that we, both good and bad, successes and the failures out of that, to be able to tweak those pilots or the actions that we take into something else in a way that we can do that quickly. Because I talked earlier about the preferred resources pilot. There's other things that I think will grow out of that. There's other things that we're contemplating that there are things that we're talking about right now, obviously with respect to the distributed resources plan that you kick this off with. We need to find a way to be able to bob and weave more nimbly on this. And I say that because the parties that are providing both the devices who are looking to serve our customers, and the customers absolutely have to come first here. We aren't doing this for utilities interests. We're not doing this for public interest. We're doing this because we have customers who either demand something or don't even know that something that exists that's going to be good for them to either not necessarily just save costs, but be something that they're interested in, what it does in terms of GHG reduction. The notion of what's success and what are the criteria that we should use for what's a good investment is probably a little different than what it's been over the last 40 years. So we have to find a way to be able to talk about that, to learn from that, and make sure we understand what those success criteria are for, because we're not all that nimble. We as big utilities aren't I often tell to people in our organization, well, nimble, forward-thinking, risk-taking, and utility, which one of those words doesn't belong with the other three? We're not good at that. That's not what we're known for. That's not what we've been in business for. And the regulatory entities struggle with that same entity because they don't want to take risks on it. Well, we're all going to have to take a little bit more risk. We have people who are out here that are providing the devices and are looking to provide the business models who are nimble. They're really nimble. They're fast. They're creating stuff quicker than we can even know about it. We need to learn about it quickly. They want to develop business models that's never been deployed before. And we need to be able to embrace both the technologies and the business models in a way that help the customers that use them, but also protect the customers that don't. And to do that, I think we're going to have a lot more repetitive conversations between regulator and regulatee on that.
Example I typically use is, again, the utility industry per se is not particularly innovative. And that on the one hand, I remember walking around and you saw the old dumb meters, right? And they bought them for 30 years. I mean, there's standard design, you have transformers, you have any number of pieces of equipment which you bought for years and years and years, that if you go to your management or go to the PUC and saying, we'll buy more of X, no one's going to really question you. On the other hand, let's face it, you have some smart meters, but if you were to make the same decision today, you would certainly get much smarter meters, or similarly, you have inverters and a lot of the DG stuff. If you were making the same specifications, they'd be a hell of a lot smarter. And so we're in an area where the technology is changing fairly quickly, and it's sort of what, in terms of your company, how to really be open to basically purchase some stuff which is not going to work as well or have some issues later, and at the same time for the commission not to simply look at it and say, why didn't you buy the least cost? Why, and so that whole paradigm, again, it's the nature of the regulations you're involving, again, just don't tend to encourage innovation, and part of it is the experimentation that's got to occur. But again, as I said, the smart meters, God bless, right. We've got them out there, they're really providing value, but, again, it's not the right decision of what you do right now. And there's going to be a whole plethora of technologies like that.
And are they smart enough?
No, they're not, right? Yeah.
Right. And, earlier in some of the sessions here today, there was a lot of discussion about, well, storage and DG and everything else needs to be the new future to meeting reliability, but talked about, both the commission's view with respect to what's reliable, your protocols, CAISO's protocols with respect to that. We're going to have to figure that out too. There's things that we're looking to do. There's things that we're looking to do in this preferred resources pilot, which is pretty good scale. We're going to ultimately implement some sort of 300 megawatts of of load displacement, basically, over the, you know, the next 7 to 10 years. We're gonna do that, and some of that in ways that you can't see. You don't know when it's on and when it's off. And that's a whole area that we need to work our way through. I don't know.
Well,
I'm
that's
taking
it.
away your
No,
moderator's
no,
role,
it's
but I
great. You
really,
guys
keep going.
I really want to hear what he has to say about that.
Go ahead, Michael, and then I was gonna add a question for Steve.
I was just gonna play off of Bob's comment about the smart meters, and I just want to note parenthetically that not all the utilities amortize their smart meters over the same period. Some people actually probably accounted for the fact that they would be seeing some changes in technology and want to start replacing them on a faster basis. And so I think that was probably a good thing that it got past our ratepayer advocates. But I can't say that without a lot of real discussion that it will necessarily not happen to other technologies, other tactics, other programs. So it is a cautionary note that we have to really think long and hard about whether it's low price or it's value that we're after.
Right. I mean, the old meters were amortized over 30 years, right? I mean, no one in their right mind would amortize the smart meters over 30 years, I hope. I haven't checked the rate treatment there, but.
One thing I just wanted to throw in for the ISO that's directly related is, as you said, Ron, that there are things that ISO or others are not going to be able to see in the system. And so we talked a lot, it's actually in our More Than Smart paper, but with the added ability of DSOs to potentially play a greater role for some of the interoperability, what does that mean? What does that mean for you? What is that extra added layer of how the DSOs actually play a potentially greater role? And we talked a bit, we had Lorenzo was here and others.
Distribution system operators.
Sorry, nice acronym.
Or in New York parlance, is distribution system platform providers. We're really good at acronyms, so you beat us.
Steve?
Yeah, and maybe let me deconstruct this for a second to make sure everybody's on the same page. The ISO, obviously, it was the balancing authority for most of California, and our principal obligation is to maintain 60 hertz across the system. That's not going to change unless the U.S. electric system does something really, really dramatic. We're going to have to maintain 60 hertz. Somebody has to maintain 60 hertz. I think that will continue to be an obligation of the independent system operator. Now, to do that, we have to have visibility of generating resources as well as transmission resources. To know the voltages on the system, to know load, demand, all those kind of concepts. We also have to, on a larger scale, maintain voltages. Now, let's then go down, so that's what's happening on the transmission system, then jump down to the distribution system. I don't think the ISO has a role in maintaining voltages and other services that the distribution systems have to maintain regular, constant quality flow of energy to people's homes and businesses. And I think that will be continued to be the purview of the distribution system owner. Now, the concept gets to be, as you get a more federated distribution system, where you have some central station stuff and you have distributed stuff and you have storage and all these things, pretty soon you start to get a pretty complicated distribution system. And then, as I said, if the utilities become agnostic to what the customers do, then you have somebody who has to provide distribution services. Because last I checked, you wanted to maintain constant voltages at your home. Still got to have these this frequency as well. Then you get the concept of this distribution system operator. I think it's a viable concept. I would say not yet. But I think it's something we have to keep our eye on, particularly as you move to higher and higher levels of distributed generation on the system. The other thing that will impact it as well are electric vehicles. They play havoc with feeders and transformers and other things like that. We're not at a tipping point now, but I do think it's something we have to think about. For us, as the transmission system operator, we're going to have greater visibility, as we do today, to generators and transmission assets. We're probably going to have more visibility into generating resources on the distribution system. I think that demarcation remains to be seen. So we'll still have to work through that. So Tony, those are my thoughts on that issue.
You know, although I think one needs to look at a couple different things, is that distribution planning, at least when I've gone through the utility rate case filings, has been relatively primitive. You know, you get the sense that they have the various areas, and the various areas draw a straight line and say, we need this much money to invest in Area A, Orange County, and this much over there. But in terms of getting a sense of systematic planning or thinking about it, you know, I've never seen that so far, unless it's buried somewhere, and I've asked data requests and never got to that. So again, it seemed to be straight line thinking, not particularly sophisticated, and the world's changing pretty fast. So it's got to become much more sophisticated. That's certainly one of the things the Energy Commission is doing, is investing in models. We've both gone back and forth, but with any model, you have to wonder, is it real? So, I mean, I know at this point, this RPE is doing the thing of let's get some synchrophasers out on the distribution system so that when you get your model results, you can figure out, do they mean anything compared to what's going out there? And as you go forward, we're going to need metrics. I mean, the basic question, as at least the anecdotal stories I hear about, well, how many TVs have been fried by DG in California this week? You know, so we need to be knowing what's going on the distribution systems and some sort of metrics. And again, when I've looked at what the utility metrics are generally for the distribution system, it's outages or stuff like that. But in terms of frequency excursions, or again, what's going on there that I know Steve on the transmission system is really looking at metrics on what's going on there, but we really need to really get a lot more sophisticated on measuring and really having metrics on what we're trying to do in the distribution system as we introduce change.
So in a quick response for Steve, and then I'm going to move to try and do the last 10 minutes for questions.
Sure, and I think Ron has something to say on this too, but there's some practical issues associated with, and clearly the ISO and the utilities are going to have to coordinate even more closely. Because when you start to even think about the practical realities of distributed generation, let's say you have 1,000 megawatts of distributed generation down in San Diego. Well, when cloud cover comes over, the load comes back up. And we have to be prepared for that, because we'll have to have units that'll be committed to be able to respond to that load pull. So that's a real good example of the visibility we have to know how much is there and where is it, so that we know if clouds come over, we're going to get more load. That we will have to work very closely with the distribution system owners and operators in the future.
However, I would say that in the future, I see something a little bit different than just that situation where you've got to have more generation to meet that requirement. Because that could be, well, how long is that cloud cover going to be? We're not really great at forecasting that, I've got to say. But part of that can be handled by storage. That could be distributed storage. Part of that could be handled by demand response. Again, you've got to determine how often you trigger that, and you've got to have contracts for that, and you have to have the expectation of customers. But you also have technologies now that can make demand response be such that the customer doesn't even know what happened as well. These are different types of things that we need to be able to do, and that's why I say we're going to have to figure out how does the distribution side of the business work with CAISO to make certain that you know what we're triggering at the distribution side of the system to be able to meet that requirement, so so you don't have to dispatch a gas-fired unit, for example, to get there. We're gonna have to learn that.
That's right, but if you don't, and I purposely didn't say that you would necessarily dispatch more generating resources per
I
se.
just interpreted that, sorry.
But in any event, you have to know what resources can be committed, whether they're demand side, energy efficiency, storage, whatever. That all has to be coordinated, because it has to, that 1,000 megawatts that drops off, the load comes up, you got to commit something.
Right, exactly.
And those are the resources that you'll have to be able to control.
And the amount of communication that we have to have about that is way more than it is today. And something we're gonna have to work our way through.
I have a feeling this is going to continue
Yeah, we'll do
beyond
this over-
today and
we'll
a
do
few
this
beers
over-
afterwards.
We'll do this over beers later, right?
That's right. So we wanted to open it up for a few questions. John has been very patient today, so I'd like to give him the first if we have a mic over there.
ISO's relationship to customers is difficult, limited, and awkward, particularly for distributed demand response resources. The earlier panel, I thought, gave some indication of what the utility could do in bridging that gap. And it seems to me that preferred resources, storage, demand response, everybody's for them. But we haven't yet got the confidence to rely on them to run the system. And so therefore, we're in danger of over-procuring conventional gas. And so I'm wondering, is there a way for the utility to provide that bridge between what the system operator thinks they need versus what the customer is willing to do short of being dispatched by the ISO? It seems that there is a significant amount of resources on the system that over time, and maybe not too long, could be mobilized. But that in a sense, the utility is going to have to be the intermediary and maybe better positioned to do that role than, say, trying to get everybody into the wholesale market.
I'll start the conversation real quick, John. There are plenty of models, particularly in the Eastern ISOs, for aggregators to bring forth significant quantities of demand response. And it's offered into the wholesale market, it's dispatchable, and it works fine. We know that model works. Now, in California, we don't have aggregators that bring that forward. The utilities, though, and I'll let Ron talk to that, they could fill that role, and they can aggregate it, they can act as a scheduling coordinator, and they can offer it up so that the ISO can dispatch it as a resource. California now is woefully behind the Eastern ISOs in demand response. The first thing you have to do for demand response is you have to procure it. You have to go get it. You got to pay for it. You got to range it. And I think that has to be something that's worked out between the PUC and the utilities to ultimately come to terms with.
I don't know that I have a lot to add to that. I think one of the things we need to recognize, John, is that everything that we're talking about in terms of these types of distributed resources aren't going to come flooding to the market overnight. We're dealing with early adopters right now. Our goal is to try to make that early adoption move as swiftly as it reasonably can in a way that continues to maintain good system reliability as we learn how this gets done. One thing to keep in mind is no matter what happens in terms of those measures being deployed, whether there ultimately becomes some third-party distribution system operator at some point once you get to some level of critical mass, if that happens, it won't be the Cal ISO that's responsible for our distribution system. It'll be the utility, and it won't be the DSO. At the end of the day, you talk about fried television sets and things of that sort. Even if it happens by virtue of performance and dynamics associated with customer solar, and it can be, and might that change as we look at these? Yes, it could. It tends to come back one way or another, rightfully or not, back on the utility. So we will be maintaining that responsibility one way or another. We need to figure out a way is how can we grow these types of resources on a reasonably accelerated path and learn from it before we get too hung up on creating a whole bunch of new players and business partners and I should say different business models. Now, I know that sounds like, oh, that's good protectionist utility. What we're really trying to do is make sure everything works first.
Great. Any comments? And then we're going to go one last question after
Sure.
you guys provide comments.
I think going back to the original Resnick Institute report, what they pointed to is that the role of something like a distribution operator really gets to, the ISO system now deals with a number of players, but it won't necessarily scale to deal with 1.5 million autos, X number of, 10 million DG projects, 10 million demand response, that there needs to be somebody to really do that aggregation, feed that back to the ISO and say, by the way, and a lot of it's probably going to have to be incredibly smart control technologies. I know when I went to the PG&E's new gas dispatch center, they're trying to get everything much more, based on computers, basically just not someone sitting there going, oh, by the way, the clouds have flickered in San Diego, let's start adjusting something, but sort of making automatic adjustments. But I mean, on the software side, again, the complexity of dealing with that system is going to be huge. Now, having said that, I always come back to the question I always ask, John's friends is say, okay, it's midnight, it's San Diego, we just lost 1,000 megawatts. What are we going to do now? And it's not going to be, let's ramp up the wind and solar more. And, it's not our current types of demand response, there's still 70 megawatts in San Diego for demand response. It was that 3 years ago. And none of it responds in less than 16 hours. So again, if you're looking for something, we really have to be realistic on the resources to again, keep the lights on. Storage, there's various things that are really opening up opportunities. And one of the things that I think all of us are confronting is that this group, all the technology people come in and say, I have the answer. This do more of my technology. And part of what we're trying to look for is the combinations. The combination of storage and demand response could be much more powerful than just storage and just demand response. And I think a lot of the new technologies we're looking at, again, is how do we do the packaging there in a way that, they're very competitive, but lots of complementary opportunities there. And that's, very important for the industry to go into the PUC and say, what do we need to do to get those packages together?
Michael, final quick word, and then we'll.
So I think that John's question gets at one of the central challenges that we face, which is that when you're dealing with large central station decisions, one decision can be fairly verifiable and you can rely on it. There is this challenge in terms of a range of distributed resources, is that the decision-making is also equally distributed. And until we actually have reliable consumer markets, it's really hard to know. And so the question becomes, how much insurance do we want?
So I'm going to ask Aram to ask a brief final question, and then we will end on that. So Aram, I did say brief.
This is Aaron. It's a short question. They might not be short answers.
Brief.
That is, I have not heard anything about jurisdiction really talked about now, and I really mean state versus federal jurisdiction. We have a mix of those entities here, but I would love to hear prognostications on what happens in an environment where utilities or PSO or ESP, whatever it may be, is doing a lot of dispatch that might look a lot more like a wholesale market product. Sorry for asking a complicated question.
30-second responses. How can we?
Pretty easy question. Things get blurry.
Pretty good.
I would just say this. Clearly, there's some complicated jurisdictional issues, but I can tell you that we certainly at the commissioner level and at the senior leadership level in the state are pretty aligned. We're not going to let jurisdiction issues get in the way of the right answer. And I think fundamentally that's the answer. We will find a way through it so that we end up doing what's right both for California and the ratepayers and frankly, for the whole region as we endeavor on these fairly existential issues of reducing greenhouse gases and find the most effective way and most reliable way of running the system.
So with that, we're at our end. If we have final 30-second, if there's any last, very brief, final comments, at least on your perspective on the conference, just last things you feel are burning to say before we head out. So Ron?
Let's not make perfect be the enemy of the good as we move into distributed energy resources. We can actually learn from this. There is actually a reason for pilots. Investing in things at a scale that is meaningful is important. I think Steve's answer was fantastic in terms of let's not let jurisdictional issues, regulatory concerns get in the way of having technological and technological advances and customer benefits happen and learn from that.
Steve?
My final word would be this. I think the era that we're moving into is cool. And I think the opportunities are just amazing when you think about the proliferation of resources on the grid and things like that. And where this will go, I don't know, and I think that's the most important thing about it. We know that there's going to be significant change. But I also think about, which we didn't talk about, it's a whole nother conference, is that we're going to have a whole lot of power in California. By 2024, we expect to have over generation on the order of about 14,000 megawatts during certain hours. And that's marginally cost zero energy. Imagine what you can do with marginally cost zero energy. There's a whole lot of industrial opportunity and other opportunity that could exist under that auspices. And we need to start today thinking about what we could do with that. Maybe we could do things like desalinate water. That would solve some of our problems on the water side. So I think there's lots of opportunities, and those are the kinds of things we need to think about. They're not problems. Let's turn them into opportunities.
Michael?
What he said.
And Bob?
Well, again, I think the key, all of us like the technology, and certainly people have visions of how their technologies can help us change the world. And again, the basic message always comes back to saying, how does this add value to the customer? If your business plan doesn't really deal with that, it's interesting and maybe fun science, but at the end of the day, we all have to connect to how to convince Californians that what we're doing adds value to their lives, and that these are wise investments. And we have to do that at a time where we're really confronting climate change. And so, as Michael said originally, that's one of our real metrics, is dealing with greenhouse gas issues. But again, we have to really, make sure that we've had some experiments which have failed, frankly, and we need to be doing this in a step-by-step methodical process. But again, I was always amazed when I dealt with different companies who would say, this is great, this is how it's really going to help me. And I'm going, okay, what's this customer, why should anyone invest in it from the rate side? They never had a good answer for that. It was just, it would be great for us moving forward. And the answer is, keep focusing on how you add value to California.
Thank you to Green Tech Media. Thanks for all the people who actually watched today. Thanks to all of you for showing up. The main thing I wanted for my quick spiel is that conferences are great. More important is to engage in the proceedings. So absolutely essential to participate and put the message in with the PUC, the CEC, and CAISO. So a huge round of applause to close out our conference for our panel. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.